My guest today is Chris Uhlmann.
I'm based in Canberra in the ACT. Most people might not know in the US that Canberra is the capital of Australia, not Sydney, not Melbourne. In fact, that was a fight that we had in Federation back in 1901 as to where the capital would be situated. So it's a bit like Washington, DC. And I've been a political reporter for a really quite a long time now, a reporter since the sort of 1989. And in politics, in Australian federal politics since around about 2000. So covering what happens here and travelling with the Prime Minister when he travelled overseas. But I've since retired essentially, so I'm a freelance journalist now. Work to a couple of different agencies. So I work in broadcast and in print.
Yeah, so your background is fascinating to me in that you had maybe decades of right in the belly of the beast of the mainstream media, right? As a news anchor and a journalist for so many decades, right?
Yeah, and look, if you talk to Australians about this, and I'm not expecting an American audience to know it, but, the ABC, which I worked for, is like the BBC, so it's a public broadcaster. I worked with the public broadcaster for 19 years, and we talk about being in the belly of the beast as far as the right in Australia would be concerned. That would be the worst possible place to be housed, but I was there for 19 years before working with Commercial Network 9 years for another 5 years.
So if you were working for them now, do you think you would feel free to express your actual opinions, or isn't there a lot of wokeness right now where you couldn't say what you really think, or how would that work?
Yeah, look, I get this a lot, but in fact, when it comes to energy and going back to 2016, where there was a fairly significant event in one of our states in Australia, and that's where we saw an entire state go black. And that's when I first got interested in what was happening to the South Australian electricity grid. In fact, I'd done a story 3 days before the lights went out in South Australia, saying it would be the canary in the coal mine because they just shut off their last coal-fired power plants. They were running mostly on wind and solar with a fair bit of gas still in the system. And the state got disconnected from the state next door in Victoria. The lights went out. I said that it was because of wind and solar, and got an enormous number of complaints through the ABC. So I have been looking at this no matter where I was for a long time now.
So have they got it fixed so that the grids are staying up, or is everything kind of on a knife edge still, that if the wrong thing happens, the grid goes down again?
Yeah, Tom, we're running on a knife edge here in Australia. So if you think about the east coast of Australia, where the major population centres are, all the way up from that tip of North Queensland that you can see on the map, right down the east coast of Australia, across the Bass Strait into Tasmania, and all the way through halfway across Australia into South Australia, we have the longest interconnected grid in the world, but it's a pretty fragile one. It's mainly been a coal-based grid throughout the course of its history. We're in the process of rapidly transitioning that now to much more wind and solar. And in fact, South Australia would be the jurisdiction that would have the largest amount of wind and solar in the world. So that's extremely fragile grid, takes a lot of management from the energy market operator. It's constantly being propped up, but we're seeing that now spread through the rest of our East Coast grid. And the thing that's terribly disturbing for me and a lot of others about this is our central nervous system that we're playing with at the moment, and we are literally conducting brain surgery on it.
How is the state of net zero right now in Australian politics? Is pretty much all in or fading a bit, or no?
Yeah, politics here is very different to politics there. There's a lock over Australian politics, really, pretty much, and I'll come to what's just changed recently in a moment, but both major parties in Australia. Now, if you like to think of our Labor Party, it's like the Democrats in the United States. Confusingly for Americans, our Liberal Party is in fact more like the Republicans in the US. It's in a coalition with a group of basically regional party called the National Party. So we call it the coalition. So the coalition sits on the right of our politics. The Labor Party sits on the left of our politics. For most of the time over the course since about 2018, both major parties have been signed up to net zero, which, as we know, is a slogan. It's not a policy. But this slogan has taken hold in Australia. Australia is largely urbanised, so no matter what people might think about this country, most Australians live in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide or Perth. Outside that, the regional communities are reasonably small. There's a lot of opposition to what's going on with the spread of transmission lines, wind and solar throughout the regions. Mostly those living in the city don't see that. And mostly they have no idea where their sources of wealth, their sources of food, and their sources of power come from. So they're now effectively voting against that. But just recently, to conclude on this, the coalition here at a federal level, so not at a state level, has decided that it's no longer going to back that net zero target. But at the moment, that party, those two parties are languishing in the polls. They were thumped at the last federal election. They are in what would appear to be near terminal decline in Australia.
Was there a lot of publicity just recently over COP30 as being like a save civilization type of thing? Or did that make big news in Australia?
Yeah, look, our Energy Minister, Chris Uhlmann, has been sort of trumpeting the fact that Australia is leading the world when it comes to the distribution of wind and solar and batteries. He's promised 2 elections ago that we would see a fall in our electricity prices. He actually put a number of it, of $275, that's Australian dollars, on 2022 prices by the 2025 election. Well, guess what? Energy prices went through the roof to such an extent that the Australian government has now spent $6.8 billion in subsidies, while it continues to tell the Australian people that electricity prices will fall. It's now just not promising when that might be, and they're going to face a really big issue shortly when they have to get rid of those subsidies or continue them forever. So Chris Bowen is an evangelist on this. He was at COP30. In fact, Australia was vying to get the 31st iteration of that jamboree of energy grifters, green energy grifters that follows, the largest carbon footprint on Earth that turns up as it has just done in Brazil. He was aiming to get that to Australia next time around. We were in a fight with Turkey, and happily for Australia, we lost that fight because it would have cost us at least 2 billion Australian dollars. But he is now going to be one of the chief negotiators for the Council of Parties 31, which means he's going to be basically trying to negotiate away Australia's natural advantage, which is we are a big coal exporter, biggest in the world, and we're a huge liquefied natural gas exporter. So those major exports for Australia will be under threat if Chris Bowen gets his way with getting fossil fuels essentially expunged by that organisation.
So I saw that you went viral, right? Questioning Chris Bowen about this, about the propaganda that energy prices were going to fall and they didn't. I think you got, I don't know how many views, enormous numbers of views for that, right?
Yeah, Tom, well, the thing about it is that before the 2022 federal election, so look, unlike the US where your cycles are 4 years, although I note that you have 2 years in Congress, which just seems madness to me to be going to the polls every 2 years. In any way, we go once every 3 years. So we had an election in 2022 where Chris Bowen and the federal Labor Party promised that electricity prices would fall. Now, I interviewed him as the political correspondent for 9 years before the election in 2022. And I said to him, prices will not fall, they will rise under the plan that you've got. Now, he was absolutely adamant that they would come down. And I said, well, either you're going to be wrong or I'm going to be wrong. We'll find out in 3 years' time. So 3 years on, which was this year, I had tried to interview him again, but I'm working as a freelance journalist now, so he's not interested in being interviewed by me. So I went on to a press club address that he had and put a series of questions to him because he was continuing to argue that prices had fallen. And get this, Tom, he was arguing the prices has fallen on the basis that the government was now subsidising them, the complete opposite of what he had promised. So, I mean, one of the things I find in politics, and I hesitate to use the word lie, but when you start out with a policy, you might be misinformed, although all the evidence from all around the world pointed you to the belief that when we saw large-scale deployments of wind and solar, that prices would rise, because that's happened in California, that's happened in the UK, that's happened in Germany, it's happened in South Australia. So we have real-world experience of this. So you might be misinformed enough to think that prices would fall. But when you see them rise every single year, 2022, 2023, 2024, and you keep claiming all the way to the 2025 election that those prices are going to fall, then that goes from being misinformation to disinformation to an outright lie. And what I said in that clip that you were talking about that went viral was, why should people believe anything that you say ever again, given this is the way that you behave? he continues to behave that way.
So that is a huge drag on the economy, right? That so many things depend on the price of electricity. And I don't know if our business is leaving and going where the electricity is cheaper.
Yeah, and now we're seeing the natural consequences of our decisions playing out, and still the government would continue to deny it. So the entire premise of us getting more jobs from the government's trajectory of having more wind and more solar is that when they generate, they are free. Now that, of course, is true in one sense, Tom, but they don't create an electricity system because they don't generate when we need it. And if we don't have power matching as a supply matching demand every second of every day, the same as it is on the US grid, that has to be completely in balance all the time, then you don't have an electricity system. So wind and solar can never form an electricity system without some kind of complex system to prop them up. They're very dispersed sources of power, so you have to spread them to the four corners of our country. You then have to connect them with transmission lines. Then they have to be backed up. You have to move this energy both in space across the landscape and in time, from the time when it's generating to the time when you actually need it. And in an energy-only market, which Australia is, then you come into a direct conflict with the marketplace, which is in our marketplace. What sets the price of electricity is the highest price of generation, not the lowest price of generation. That's common around the world, which means that these huge gaps have to be filled by something. So they're filled by coal at the moment. That keeps the price relatively stable, but we're exiting coal stations really, really rapidly here. That means it moves up the price curve to hydropower is more expensive than coal power here. And then to gas, which is more expensive than hydro. And Tom, guess what's the most expensive form of dispatchable energy that we have on the grid at the moment? It's batteries, which is the wind, solar, and batteries equation that we were sold, because it's an arbitrage business. They buy low, they sell high. They're always going to do that. The price they set in the marketplace will always be higher than what we had with coal. So Australia now is on a trajectory to really high electricity prices and really, really high wages. And that's an equation which will not add up for us in the 21st century. And we're already seeing the destruction of businesses here.
Does Australia have huge battery installations right now where they try to back up a city for a few hours?
Yeah, we do, and we're starting to get more and more of them. But again, as you'd be well aware, because you're seeing the same thing in a state like California, and I know I've been to California and I've been to Texas, and I've seen, Texas in fact has more wind and solar on the grid than California does. But the problem with batteries is they're 8 hours duration, usually maybe 12 hours. That can move energy from the middle of the day to the ends of the day. So you might see some flattening of that cost curve. But what happens is it can't move it across several days. So particularly through the southern part of Australia, it does get quite cold during winter. And we've got huge amounts of sunshine here, of course, but it gets quite grey as well at that time of the year. And after 8, 10, 12 hours or 1, 2, or 3 days, batteries get drained. And so then you have to have something to back everything else up. And the remarkable thing about what happened in Australia, the people who were really avid on pushing out that we would have a wind, solar, and batteries grid never understood that the entire thing could never add up unless there was a dispatchable source of power, something that you could direct onto the marketplace. That has been coal. Our coal-fired fleet is aging. So the bridge is going to be gas. But the same people who argued for wind and solar argued strongly against getting any new gas developments in Australia. We have an abundance of gas, but they effectively banned gas exploration in Victoria and New South Wales, which means we're now years behind getting this development up and running to try and support the grid which they are building. We are so stupid here that we did not understand the consequences of what we were doing, and now we're playing catch up. Gas price in Australia is 3 or 4 times higher than it is in the United States.
Is there hope that the grid can be fixed, or do you need more power failures? Or did the failure that happened, did that have some effect in restoring sanity somewhere in Australia?
No, Tom, because there's a giant NGO industrial complex that's lined up with business, that's lined up with government in Australia that are all on the same song sheet and does not appear to matter. the evidence of their own eyes, the evidence of what we see on our power bills does not appear to matter because they're locked into some kind of theological discussion about the value of energy sources. When you decide that you are going to change the priorities in your energy system, particularly your electricity system, but it goes more broadly than that, it is that the whole idea of an electricity system is to deliver affordable, reliable power. But when you decide that you're going to change the direction of that and what you want it to do is to cut carbon emissions, then obviously it's not going to deliver what you want. It's going to do something completely different. We're in the process of doing all this now. Now, I do think that there is an awakening in some of the business community, but Australian businesses are extremely gutless when you compare them to something like the United States. You've got a lot more diversity in your states there. So you've got Republican governments which are pushing back very hard, obviously at a federal level now, but you had them at a state level before. So and they're really quite strong. Well, all of our people were on the same page. And I do think that Australian businesses now are in the business of subsidy harvesting. There's a lot of money to be made if you sign up to this agenda, and that's where they're making their money now. There's almost no project that's proceeded on the east coast of Australia in wind or solar in about the last 3 years that has not had some kind of government subsidy behind it.
Well, I'm just looking at a map of Australia here, and you mentioned this, but off the top of your head, do you know how far your longest transmission lines are going across Australia? Or practically, is there some limit?
Yeah. So we're talking. We've got around about. I'm looking on. I'd have to go back and double check the figures. But if you look at that map and you go up to the very tip, so around about where you'll see Cairns, and then work your way down the east coast of Australia. So you go Cairns, and then down to Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland, then down into Sydney, which is the capital of New South Wales, then down into Melbourne. I've driven this. It from my place in Canberra, which is between Sydney and Melbourne, it takes you 3 days, essentially, if you're driving 8 to 10 hours a day to get anywhere near Cairns. So these are huge distances. So Australia is a big country, and it has a very, very dispersed population. So, we're occupying a land mass that's not that much smaller than the United States, but we have 26 million people. And they're mostly congregated down that east coast corridor that you can see there. And then it gets more dispersed as you head across, as you head west there, you'll see to Adelaide in South Australia. So it is considered to be the largest, the longest grid in the world. And it's very fragile one because there are not great interconnections between the states. So, we're talking tens of thousands of kilometres of transmission lines. By the way, we have to build another 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines to try and connect all of this dispersed wind and solar that we're building. So again, that's another cost that gets added to your bill. So in Australia, the costs are, and they'd be pretty much the same in the United States. The wholesale cost of electricity is the only place where wind and solar can ever have an effect on driving the cost down. It doesn't do that because that's not the way electricity is priced. So everything else it drives up. So the transmission and distribution charges, the network charges will inevitably rise because we have to build so many more transmission lines. As we put more and more electric vehicles onto a street, the distribution systems will have to be buttressed. So we'll have to put billions of dollars into that. And the green schemes that we've got to help pump up all the subsidies, that price of your bill goes up. So essentially, every single part of an electricity bill is driven up the higher and higher you go with penetrations of wind, solar, and batteries.
So you have a Substack called Power Lines, and also a podcast, I think you call that also Power Lines. And it looks like you're referencing the work of Catherine Porter and Robert Bryce and all sorts of people who have their arms around this. Do you think that you are helping to bring people up to speed on what really works and what doesn't on a grid?
Yeah, look, I'm trying, and there are a group of people in Australia who are trying, and we've had some traction recently. The coalition here, that Liberal and National Party coalition I was telling you about at the federal level, has now decided to dump net zero as a target. The problem is they're dreadful, right? They have essentially been gutted in Australia's parliament over the course of the last 2 elections. They've lost 34 seats. Now, there's only 150 seats in Australia's federal parliament on both sides of politics. So that group is in the process essentially of being deconstructed. The personnel that they've got left aren't particularly strong. there's a challenge against the leader of that party. We'll see how long Susan Lee lasts, but now that party is tearing itself apart internally, and of course, all of the commentary, the political commentary in Australia is, it's after this, therefore because of this. It's because they have decided to ditch this target. They're being punished by the electorate. Look, I think there are lots of reasons why the Liberal National Party is being punished by the electorate. This is just one of them. But the argument is there to be made because the facts and the truth are on our side. What we're seeing in Australia is playing out around the world. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of net to work with, Tom. Our industry here, our manufacturing sector, like the US manufacturing sector was hollowed out, but yours was much bigger than ours. We are now seeing the closure or the intended closure of our last aluminium smelters because they're the biggest drawers of power. So Tomago in New South Wales uses about 10% of New South Wales' energy. It's on its knees now because of high energy prices. The Labor government is trying desperately to bail it out. So yet again, we will see government money applied to private business to keep it afloat. And it's being driven into the ground by government policies which are pushing up energy prices. Tom, we had a settlement in Australia essentially when we federated in 1901, when all the states got together happily, peacefully to form the Federation of Australia. And that was that we would be a high wage economy. Australia's always been a high wage economy. The labour unions here are very strong. That worked because we were a very low cost energy economy. We had huge amounts of brown coal and black coal. Victoria's brown coal fields still have 800 years worth of supply. Guess what? We've decided that we're not going to use that. We export 6 or 7 times more coal than we actually burn in Australia. Now try and get your head around that. If you're concerned about this stuff, well, a ton of coal burned anywhere is a problem everywhere. Well, they're burning it in China to make goods to send back to Australia. You couldn't make this stuff up.
I just enjoyed listening to a podcast you did where you were talking with someone about the idea of maybe Chinese espionage in the country, or you're buying parts for electrical grid and they might have back doors in them where people remotely in China could possibly shut down parts of the grid. How worried are you about that threat to the grid in Australia?
The same as you should be, and people have been much more vocal there. So if you look up salt typhoon or bolt typhoon, we're not talking now, we tend to think of when someone hacks into your computer, they're looking for information or they're trying to steal something, which has been the Chinese MO really forever. But they've gone beyond that now. What the Chinese Communist Party is doing is essentially inserting virtual bombs into our networks, yours and ours. And it's not just the electricity grid, it's also into things like dams or into other really important critical infrastructure. So these things are inserted into, say, your grid, and they just sit there. What are they waiting for? Well, they're waiting for the time when push might come to shove, and it might never. But if we ever get into a conflict with China, what will happen is the lights will go out in Australia and all of the transmission systems will go down. Our capacity to be able to communicate with each other will be cut off because all of the phone systems will go down. We are completely compromised in Australia now. We've gone through several iterations of our relationship. We around about 2017, 2018, 2019, Australia was a very loud voice under the former coalition government in warning the rest of the world, and particularly the United States. I was at a meeting in Washington when Donald Trump, in his first iteration, met with Malcolm Turnbull, our then Prime Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull was warning Donald Trump about the dangers of Huawei, which is the Chinese telecommunications company, about the dangers of having them in your system. Now, because of all of that, Australia was punished economically by China for several years. What happens then, of course, is the Labor Party takes power, desperate to try and settle relationships with China. So now really China is the word that dare not speak its name in Canberra. We don't ever criticise the Chinese Communist Party anymore because we just want to keep the peace.
Do you think the whole push for woke electricity around the Western world because of climate reasons, do you think there are sinister reasons behind that maybe communists from China or elsewhere might be pushing this to gain competitive advantage or to cause the destruction of the West?
Well, no, it wasn't a plan. It worked out well for the Chinese. So think about what we, and when I say we collectively as the West have managed to do in this energy transition, right? So I interviewed our environment minister back in 1992 or 1993, whenever the Rio Earth Summit was on. And that was the first time I ever heard anyone talk about climate change and the fact that we are going to do it. To do something about it. And that's where we began this carbon cutting journey. And the United States as an honest broker and Europe as an honest broker and countries like Australia started to try and rein in their carbon emissions. And if you look what happened to our, particularly our electricity generation over time doesn't really rise that much. We've become much more efficient in the things that we do. But essentially what we begin to do is to just move the emissions around the world. So carbon emissions have gone up every single year since 1993, except when we shut down the planet for COVID-19 or there was a worldwide recession, as there was during the financial crisis. That's when we know how to cut carbon emissions. That's to have a massive recession. So they've gone up every single year. All we've done is move the point at which they're produced. And how do we do that? We offshore all of our manufacturing to China. Now, China now burns 57% of the world's coal and has captured 1/3 of the world's manufacturing. Essentially, almost nothing that we really need for our modern existence doesn't have some pathway through China at some stage. And they've been ridiculously good at cornering the market in all of the things that we want for this energy transition. So they make the solar panels using slave labor and our coals that produce them as cheaply as they possibly can. They make the wind turbines, they make the electric vehicles, and then they flood the international market with them, which means that we can't compete with their prices, particularly on electric vehicles and solar panels. So we can't make those things here in Australia. You can't make them competitively in the United States because they're getting a state subsidy also to do that. So yeah, you could be a conspiracy theorist and think that they designed it this way, or maybe it was just luck and happenstance, but we have been remarkably stupid. And so it's good to see the Trump administration in the United States pushing back. Now, I don't agree at all with everything that Donald Trump does, but his energy secretary is on the right track with this stuff. He is trying to get back the power that comes with real power, coal, oil and gas. You know, the United States now, it's been on the track to do this for a long time. It's one of the world's largest exporters of liquefied natural gas. It's the world's largest exporter of oil now, which means the United States is in a position to reassert its power. A country like Australia, we're just about to give it all away.
So how do you feel about the future of pushing back against this madness in terms of, I think the UN is just saying that we're really going to focus on climate disinformation and we got to make sure to stamp that out, et cetera. Do you think that we're going to have free speech 5 years from now as much as we have today?
Well, you will, because you've got a constitutionally enshrined right to it, and they will not be able to get rid of that. That does not exist in Australia. I've always been proud to be in Australia. We have a robust democracy. We have had for a long time a commitment to free speech, but that has been eroded over time, and there's no protection. There's no safety net to stop us falling. So right now, there's a Senate committee inquiry that's been set up into disinformation and misinformation about climate and energy. It was set up by a Greens senator. It's supported by the Labor Party. And what its intention is, it already knows the conclusion that it's going to come to, right? Which is that people like me and people like other groups around the country, like the Centre for Independent Studies here has been very vocal. There've been several of them anyway that have been quite vocal, with small, not particularly well funded. They are going to try and pass laws to silence us. So they will define what disinformation, misinformation is, and then they will create laws to try and silence those who disagree with them. So we are really now we've gone from this just being battle to this being an all-out war to try and protect at least our freedoms to disagree. And there are rural communities right across Australia who are pushing back against transmission lines. They're having their property rights confiscated now. So because the government couldn't get it through as fast as it wanted to, in Victoria now, if you don't actively assist in someone who wants to put a transmission line on your property, then there's a $12,000 fine. If you're a company, which most of them are, it's about $30,000 fine. So farmers in Victoria at the moment, Australia South, are locking slapping the gates against these people. We'll see whether or not they are prosecuted by government, but the law's against them.
What is the status of gun control right now in Australia? Can private people own rifles?
Yeah, look, on properties they do, but back in 1996, a then Conservative Prime Minister John Howard managed to get, after we had a big shooting here in Tasmania, where 35, I think, people died, there was a nationwide gun control, buy back the guns, essentially. So a lot of Australians handed their guns back in. So one of the real advantages we have here, and I know that people like to debate the toss, but in Australia, gun crime is way less than it is in the United States. Death by guns here is quite a rare event, although lots of guns do get smuggled in. But when it comes to the population, no Australian, not like the United States, there's no Second Amendment that says, it is a second one, isn't it? Second Amendment, which says that that you have a right to bear arms. Here, no, Australians don't carry guns as a general rule.
Do you think there is any plan in Australia to force digital ID, maybe to protect children? You have to have a digital ID to post online, for example, or you use this digital ID also, it'll be connected to your bank account or to a central bank digital currency. So that if they don't like what you post somewhere, then they can cut off your funding or cut off your ability to get your own money out.
There are several things that are happening here now. One of them is that the Australian government, again, is leading the charge on getting young people off social media. So there's an effective ban that's coming into force, which is if you are under 16 years of age, then you aren't allowed to access so-called social media anymore. Now, that will be extremely difficult to enforce without trying to find some way to identify people. So all of these things are a work in process. The ideas get floated a long time before they actually happen. But I can imagine a time when absolutely that would be the case here. Look, one of the things I find, and it's been sort of I feel like I've been in a losing battle for a long time. But now, back through my career in journalism when I was working for the Canberra Times, which is a bit like the Washington Post, or it used to be. It's essentially dead now. But I staged a rearguard action against racial vilification laws, which, I don't believe that anyone should be racist, right? But I also don't believe that you should start legislating away free speech, essentially in a country which has got, like Australia, which has got very strong defamation laws, got nothing like the protections you have in the United States. People can sue and win quite easily here. And the other thing too is that we have other laws that look after whether or not people are being violent. So I didn't think there was any need to police people's language. I was concerned that once that law got in, it would be endlessly extended, as it has been. So on that front, we've seen the gradual erosion of Australia's rights to free speech on the basis that, they're being protected from people behaving in a racist way. Well, some of the cases that we've seen have been absolutely absurd. It's not about racism, it's about silencing people that you don't like. So we lost that particular battle. And every time it seems to me that we've tried to make an argument here for free speech, it's been eroded. And I blame both sides of politics for that. I blame the Labor Party for largely pushing it and the coalition for being completely gutless in opposing it.
What is your view on the security of elections in Australia? Because I do think we've had massive fraud in the U.S. elections in recent years. But
yeah, look, I think that is a real problem for all democracies, right? One of the things that happens is that our adversaries don't play by the rules that we like to play by or imagine that we play by, and they're happy to interfere at all stages, at all times. So this is becoming an increasing problem. One of the things that is good about Australia is we have some very solid institutions. Our electoral commission is separate from both major parties. So whenever we have redistricting here in Australia, it is done on the basis of population. It's not a map that's drawn up by a politician. So I think that's a real strength of our democracy because, we've seen, in the past in Australia, and things are happening in the present United States, which I don't think are great, where essentially people are trying to find ways to make sure that they can create electorates that only vote one way. But we have seen, some mild attempts here to try and interfere with our elections. The Electoral Commission has been very strong in trying to protect our systems. But the more and more that they become digital, the more easy they are to access. And I just think Australia's an open book. There is not a single system in Australia that the Chinese Communist Party would not be all over.
So is there a lot of mail-in voting and they can keep counting votes until they win the election days after without no photo ID? that type of thing?
Yeah, no. So there's no identification required. There's been some discussions about that. You do have to go and get your name ruled off on the electoral roll. So that there is that, at least that level. So when you go into vote, you've got to give your name and obviously have a line put through your name. One of the things that we've done, same in the United States, I think, at least in some of the states and some of the I think in the federal election as well, we've opened polling booths a lot earlier. It used to be you had to vote on the day. Now there was a 2-week window that's being narrowed a little bit at the moment. So yeah, I think that the opportunities are there for people to to misbehave in elections. I think Australia's systems so far have been reasonably robust because the institution, as I say, stands separate from the political parties. And they are very well aware of the threats.
All right. I have a quote from you about COVID that I want to read here. You wrote, I believe, COVID was the moment when bureaucracies learned how easy it is to control a population through fear. Does that sound like a correct quote that did come from you?
Yeah, look, when the same as all of the rest of us, right? So when COVID first hit in Australia, I remember vividly, I was reporting on federal politics at a time when our state and federal governments got together and decided they would lock the entire country down, close the borders. Now, when it first hit, and we didn't know the nature of this disease, that made sense to me. So I didn't object to the first round, right? So while we were waiting to see how dangerous this disease was, I mean, would it be the plague? Would it kill 1 in every 3 people? In which case you could justify keeping people locked up. But after that first lockdown, it became reasonably obvious, I think, even to a casual observer, that it was mostly killing the elderly. Now, I don't want anyone to die. But right now, the average age of deaths in Australia from COVID, after all that we have seen, is about 85. And what's the average age of death in Australia? About 85. So what I found really objectionable was when we decided, after that became reasonably obvious, obviously we're working on vaccines, that you would start shutting down schools. And Australia got into this lockdown mentality, particularly in Victoria, which ended up having the longest lockdown in the world. The damage we thought we were doing, I thought, was immense. So even in 2020 and 2021, I was writing then for 2 newspapers that were in the same stable, one in Melbourne and one in Sydney, our 2 biggest papers, and it was a very unpopular position to hold, I know, because at one stage they refused to publish one of my opinion pieces in the Melbourne-based paper because I was so critical of the Victorian government. Societies have progressed in the past because we looked after our women and children. I mean, there's a reason why in the Titanic they said women and children first, right? You can always get more blokes, sorry blokes, but the women and children, if you want your society to flourish, then you make sure that you look after them, and particularly the children. That we inverted that during COVID, that we decided that the rights of the elderly should outweigh the rights of the young. And look at the damage that we would done. And this is self-evident. Like I wrote in 2020, one day we would be debating what was worse, the disease or the cure. The jury is in. What was way worse was the cure. The damage that we have done will ricochet for generations. It is an indictment of the parties that we're in. And again, all of them were complicit in this. So all of our political parties lined up to back in large-scale lockdowns of our populations. And the thing that was most terrifying was that the population was pretty much happy to go along with it. And if you were critical of it, as I was and a few others were, the level of criticism that you came in from, and again, people wanting to silence you, having the comment piece, I was published once a fortnight, that was the agreement. They pulled one of my comment pieces out of that paper because they didn't like the tone of it. That was self-censorship by the media. And that was the other thing that really infuriated me. The media should be a critic of government, should be skeptical of government. It should not be the police force for government, which is what my profession became in this country.
So do you think most people in Australia have figured out that the cure was worse than the disease? Or do you have a lot of people that are on their gene therapy shot number 8 or 10 now and they're wearing their mask everywhere and all that?
Yeah, look, I went along. I went along with being vaccinated at first because I had two uncles who had polio. I was old enough to remember that. And the polio vaccine is an absolute miracle, and it did tremendous things. Now, look, but there's no doubt about the fact that when the vaccines do also damage people, some people have very bad side effects. That's well documented. The problem we were having was that if you didn't get vaccinated in Australia, they'd take your job. So you were being forced by government to have them interfere with your body. Now, I think that if the vaccine was efficacious and it didn't do any damage, then you should probably take it. But I don't believe that anyone should ever be forced by government to take a drug, particularly when these were brand spanking new drugs with a new kind of system that we didn't really know the outcomes of. And again, I think that the evidence, again, that, look, you've been good at this. I really admire the United States in the sense that the transparency there is far greater than it is in Australia. We should have had what we call a royal commission here, which is the biggest possible inquiry that we could have. The government never did that because it knew that if it did, the states of Victoria, the state of Victoria in particular, a Labor state, would come out very badly out of that. And so the Labor federal government didn't want the Labor government Victoria to look bad. But, in the US, you have seen inquiries when you've inquired into how efficacious the vaccines were. Well, it turns out a whole lot less than we were told. A lot of the promises that were made at the time were simply wrong. And some people have been badly damaged by this vaccine. Now, this is not, by me, an argument against vaccines. I think that vaccines on the whole have been a good thing. But never, ever should a government impose its will on a free citizen to make them inject themselves or lose their job. And certainly people lost their jobs here.
So let's switch gears and talk about this. You wrote 3 books and then a Netflix series. There's 2 seasons of Secret City on Netflix, and that's based on your work, right? I just pulled those up on Netflix, and I'm excited to watch, actually.
Yeah, and you can see those in the United States. Yeah, so a friend of mine, Steve Lewis, and I got together about 2012 when Australian politics seemed particularly crazy. Little did we know that it was going to get crazier. And again, the defamation laws here are so bad. We thought we don't want to write, yet another boring book about politics in Australia, which no one would read. We thought we'd turn our hand to fiction. And so we essentially, in the first book that we wrote, we fictionalized a whole lot of Australian politicians. And what it was, the deeper issue that we were looking at was the changing landscape of the media, but also the fact that Australia would be caught between its major trading partner, China, and its key ally, the United States. Like, you rewind to then, what you'll find is all Australian politicians would say that this could be managed, that we could find a balance between the two, that we didn't have to choose between America and China. Our book said one day we are going to have to choose. And, the spoiler alert, if you're going to watch it, is that we had a Mandarin-speaking Australian Prime Minister then, Kevin Rudd. He is now the ambassador to the United States. So you can go and see him there in Washington if you have a mind to. Well, he was our Prime Minister for a time. And we thought, gee, he learned to speak Mandarin. And what if, just imagine, if the Australian Prime Minister had been a spy? And so that essentially is the premise of the book. Now, look, in Australia, you can be sued for defamation in Australia in a work of fiction if a politician believes that they can identify, or anyone believes they can identify themselves and prove before a court that is the case. So, when we are asked about this, particularly in Australia, of course, we say that it is all fiction. And yet there are a remarkable number of Australian politicians who seem to have identified themselves in that book. It's a long time ago now. Hopefully none of them sued.
Very interesting. I didn't know that was a thing, that if there's some fictional character that you think is you, in Australia, you can sue. In America, could you sue? I wonder.
No, your defamation laws are way better than ours. We have the worst defamation laws in the Western world. We've now got politicians in Australia suing each other for calling each other names. And I've always thought, as a journalist or a politician, you should never sue anybody. If you dish it out, you should be prepared to take it. And look, unfortunately, too many people in Australia have a glass jaw, but there's an incentive now. You can get quite a lot of money by suing a political opponent and get quite a lot of traction in the media about it. We're seeing case going here at the moment now, which has gone through 2 or 3 different levels of appeal between a Greens senator and between a senator who is from One Nation, who would be the equivalent of a Nigel Farage sort of party. So she's on the right of the political spectrum and the other one's on the left, and they should have their argument in the Senate where they both are. They've decided to drag it into the courts.
So that is a thing, though, as a fiction writer in Australia. And if you're thinking of a real person as you're writing, you definitely want to tweak the fictional person in certain ways to make sure that there's not too much of a match, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm pretty safe in telling this particular story now. But when we were getting new publication, our publisher HarperCollins said, could you send us a list of anyone who might imagine that they see themselves in this book? And we went, oh, I should sit that down. And we sent them 14 names. Then we live in Canberra. We got called to Sydney to talk to our publisher. And the publisher had 2 lawyers, not one, but 2 lawyers. So they had the in-house lawyer and they'd hired a barrister. So, you know, the most expensive lawyer that you can get, the one that argues the case before court. And clearly he was a man who liked literature and he thought our book was rubbish. You could tell they'd forced him to read it. So he was doing this all under sufferance. And he said, look, I can see what you've done here. You've taken a male prime minister and made him a female, and you've changed this person's sex. And but this defence minister that you've got, I can't see any way around it. There's a case in the Supreme Court in Sydney right now about a defence minister being accused of having a Chinese Matahari, which is true, right? So there've been a whole lot of stories about this, hotly denied, of course, by the defence minister and taken to court. Anyway, we were aware of this. Yes, we've heard about that. We do know. He said, well, can you make the defence minister a woman? And we said, no, the defence minister really needs to be a man. It's not gonna work for us. And I said, we were just, you know, as we're freebasing on this stuff, I said, well, what if we gave him a disability? He'd been a union official, right? So what if he'd had an industrial accident and he was in a wheelchair? And the barrister's face lit up and he said, yes, that would work. You could put him in a wheelchair. And I said, oh, no, hang on, man. He's in a sex scene. And we're having a hard enough time writing sex scenes without trying to work out how you do that in a wheelchair. I said, well, what if he lost a hand, like from a drop saw in an industrial accident? And he said, yes. And I said, well, what if he had a hook for a hand? Like, and he would use this as a thing because he's a tough union official. So that's the only reason the hook's in the book, to avoid defamation.
Really? Yep. That's a whole world I know nothing about. That's fascinating. So we're coming up kind of to the end of our hour here. Do you have other stuff you want to cover before we finish up?
No, mate, look, that's it. Look, all I can say is that I love the United States, love traveling there. One of the things I really adore about the US is the freedoms that you have. Don't always agree with everybody in politics, politics there on the left or the right. But what I love is the robust nature of the debate. I hope, you know, long live America as far as I'm concerned. I get concerned about some of the attacks that I see on the institutions, and that occurs on both sides of politics. I get concerned about the fact that, you know, like here, we're now seeing too much of our politics play out in courts, where people are essentially trying to weaponize the court system against their political opponents. Rather they kept it to the floor of the House of Congress or in and out of the White House. They've got enough power there. They don't need to really be punishing people in those sorts of ways. But, you know, let's face it, both sides of politics are doing it in the United States. Both sides of politics are doing it in Australia through different means. I think that's a pretty poor trajectory for our political systems. But, you know, the other thing I would say too is that the alliance with the United States is the most important one that we have. We are certainly finding the pressure from the Chinese Communist Party here in Australia to be extraordinary. We've got a defence pact with the United States. And this is one of the areas where I do have some issues with Donald Trump. It is that the alliance system built and maintained by the United States after the Second World War should be among the crown jewels. It disturbs me when I see, particularly those in Asia, you know, with Japan, although that's been repaired a bit, but, you know, and with Korea and with Australia, that alliance system is going to be absolutely necessary in the 21st century, because we will find the rise of China becoming less and less comfortable. Certainly from where we sit, the United States is absolutely crucial. So thank you. We've enjoyed your support since MacArthur came here during the Second World War. support the American troops. There are a million American troops came through Australia during the Second World War. This was the base of operations for the war in the Pacific. Australians have never forgotten that. It's hugely important to us, and long may it prosper.
I did want to ask, in addition, though, do you think if there's a rise of common sense and less wokeness around the world, is there some effect on Australia from that? Do you think that, for example, if Trump cuts funding for woke energy, is there a chance that some of that funding gets cut in Australia and it helps out Australia? Or is that not a dynamic that's happening?
Well, I think news comes slowly to the provinces, right? And we're about as far as we can get from the rest of the world in some of this sort of stuff. You know, our people aren't paying enough attention to what's happening in the rest of the world. Trump has certainly changed the atmospherics of all of this and changing on the ground what's happening. And you could see from that COP30, where they didn't put fossil fuels into the final communique, that's had a huge effect. So I think that the demonstration effect, the actual effect, I think in the end, physics will have I say here in Australia, but look, you know, in my early days, maybe back when I left school, I joined a Catholic seminary and stayed to be a priest for about 3.5 years. And we used to say in Australia that the further you get from Rome, the more orthodox you become. So when it comes to wokeness, we are still well and truly in the grip of the mind virus here. I don't see a whole lot of change in that. I do hope for some sort of change, but at the moment, I can tell you, like, from where we sit, the small hardy band of energy objectors here, we call ourselves the 300, like the Spartans. I say, you know, when we get together, we will die, but Greece may be saved.
All right, that's a good point to end on. But thank you for all you're doing. I'm a big fan. Chris Uhlmann, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.